believe is lesson 12 on institutionalism. I wanted to spend just a little more time looking at some of the different viewpoints on the two issues that we've been looking at in the past two lessons on the Missionary Society and also on the instruments in music. And in our book, it was for the most part looking at it from one side, one standpoint, of which we would probably agree with. But I really wanted to have a good view of both sides of this, and particularly let you hear the voices of those during that time period, hear in their own words how they felt about these issues, and in that way to be a little bit closer to that time period and the Restoration movement, and particularly what was going on with the division that was going on between these folks. And I think that will be helpful not only from a historical standpoint, but also as we do move into more recent time periods and more recent issues that we continue to struggle with. Hopefully it'll help us to see maybe some of the patterns that are being repeated in our day and time and in recent past as well. And the material I'm using is a different set of material. These were some lessons that were put together by L.A. Stouffer in a series of classes that I attended at one point. And so this is his material, although he's really taking information from his history books in relation to the Restoration. So a lot of these are quotes, that he's got from other writers. But I think he does a really good job of putting together both sides on these issues so that we can hear the voices of those involved during that time period. Now, as we start here, I'm going to read what was written by a couple of different writers in relation to the two approaches in relation first to the Missionary Society. And I think this kind of in way of an introduction sets the stage for the differences that existed. And it just goes a little bit more deeper than what we had in our book. And I think, to me, helps understand really the kind of the crux of the issue that was going on at that time. So the first quote here is from A.W. Fortune in his book, The Disciples of Kentucky, who talks about two approaches here concerning the silence of the Scriptures. A.W. Fortune in The Disciples of Kentucky succinctly described the two interpretations of the Restoration movement. There were two different interpretations of the church which inevitably came into conflict. There were those who believed the church should move on with the rest of the world and adapt the spirit of the New Testament to conditions that were ever changing. They held that when not forbidden by the New Testament, they were free to adapt their program to changing needs. On the other hand, there were those who believed the matter of the church was fixed for all times, and the fact that certain things were not sanctioned was sufficient ground for rejecting them. The men on both sides were equally honest, but they had a different approach to these issues that were raised. And that's a quote from A.W. Fortune, but it's actually found in Homer Haley's book, Attitudes and Consequences in the Restoration Movement, which I find interesting because it's a book I don't have on the Restoration Movement, and I have to look for that sometime. I'm sure it'd be a good read. Okay, he goes on and talks a little bit more about the viewing of silence here that was brought up in that point, or that quote. Lester McAllister and William E. Tucker in Journey in Faith relate these two approaches to Thomas Campbell's celebrated slogan and give two views of it. Anybody remember what the slogan was of Thomas Campbell? Heard it quite a few times at this point. I know. That's part of it. Okay, that's the gist of it, yeah. We will speak where the Bible speaks, let us be silent where the Bible is silent. Okay, so that's what he's talking about here, okay? Here's the quote. So many years earlier, They say Thomas Campbell unintentionally had laid the foundation for a full-scale debate. In the Declaration and Address, Campbell proposed that followers of Christ accept the New Testament as the church's constitution. He added nothing ought to be received into the faith or worship of the church, or to be made a term of communion among Christians that is not as old as the New Testament. Rejecting all creedal affirmations in the interest of restoring the ancient order, Campbell summarized his biblicism in the form of a motto: where the scriptures speak, we speak; where the scriptures are silent, we are silent. Now here's the two different approaches here, two different groups. He calls the first group strict constructionists. In time, this expression, i.e. what Campbell wrote, accepted as a slogan by disciples everywhere, created more problems than it solved. Strict constructionists, or scholastics among the disciples, insisted that the church's organization and elements of worship must be derived from explicit scriptural commands and precedents. That which the Bible does not specifically teach is prohibited, they maintained. The silence of the scripture was binding to their way of thinking. The other group was progressive disciples, convinced that such legalistic primitivism utterly perverted Thomas Campbell's motto. Moderate or progressive disciples retorted that the silence of the New Testament was permissive rather than restrictive. Responding to the strict constructionists, they countered that which the Bible does not specifically prohibit is permitted. Now, do you see in those two groups the conflict, in those statements the conflict? I mean, really, you have two statements that are complete opposites to one another, if you think about it. They are, literally diametrically opposed. So you can see why this would be an issue. There's some other quotes here that really do a good job of summing up the differences. W.E. Garrison, as Haley quotes, summarizes the issue by stating that the crux of it was a difference of opinion as to the extent to which the church of today and of all time is limited by the pattern of the primitive church. Now, he goes on here and he gives two quotes as examples of each side of this. The first one is Pendleton, W.K. Pendleton, who was son-in-law of Alexander Campbell. Pendleton, the quote from him was, "Let it not be said then that the disciples of Christ are to take the silence of Scripture on a given subject as a positive prohibition against all freedom of action or obligation of duty. No rule could be more productive of evil than this." That's Pendleton, W.K. Pendleton. The other side of this is from Jacob Creeth, who wrote, "You say that our Savior and the apostles did not denounce conventions as such. Did they denounce popery or corrupt Protestantism as such? Did they denounce infant baptism or creed making or auricular confession as such? It is for you to show where they authorized conventions." So, here you have two quotes on each side of this. Can you see the difference there in their mindsets? You can see a very different approach to the scriptures, and particularly to the silence of the scriptures in those two. Okay, let me read some quotes here from those who were defenders or proponents of the Missionary Society. In other words, we're going to look at quotes from men who were saying we should have a missionary society. Then we're going to look at some quotes of those who was opposed to it. Okay. First one is from Alexander Campbell. In a series of articles on church organization, Campbell wrote, "Have we then no scriptural model, no divine precedent or authority for any form of church organization and cooperation?" In a later article, he answers, "In all things pertaining to public interest, not of Christian faith, piety, or morality, the Church of Jesus Christ in its aggregate character is left free and unshackled by any apostolic authority. This is the great point which I assert as of capital importance in any great conventional movement or cooperation in advancing the public interest of a common Christianity and a common salvation. My strong proof for this conclusion is that while faith, piety, and morality are all divinely established and enacted enacted by special agents, apostles, and prophets possessed of plenary inspiration, matter of prudential arrangements for evangelizing of the world for the better application of our means and resources according to the exigencies of society and the ever-varying complexion of things around us, are left without a single law, statute, ordinance, or enactment in the New Testament. Again, note Campbell's emphasis on silence, and in his view, it's permissiveness. So again, Campbell uses a lot of fancy words, and there's, he kind of goes around a lot before drawing his sentences to a close. But do you see what he's saying there? No. No? Okay. Well, fair enough. Thanks for being honest. Okay, that's it. And I would add in one area, he says notice in the aggregate, he makes a difference between the church as a whole versus a person's individual walk as a Christian. And where he's talking about, notice he says, not of Christian faith, piety, and morality. He's saying those things, you have apostolic, plenary inspiration, that is verbal inspiration of the scripture about those things. He's saying that when it comes to, in the aggregate character, the church is left free and unshackled by apostolic authority. He's saying here that there is no really teaching on this. There is no inspiration on the church acting in the aggregate or as a whole. And so we are left then, he says, to basically go to whatever means or resources that we need to use to carry out the work. Okay? Does that clarify some, Becky?
Yeah, he's saying there's not any authority.
Not any authority as he sees it for the church in the plural, and he's saying that's leaving then it open for them to use whatever method. But he's saying as far as individuals, there is teaching as far as how we should live our lives or conduct ourselves. So he's kind of drawing a distinction there between individual morality and teaching versus the functioning of the church as a whole. Of course, well, I don't want to go to the opponent yet. We'll save that. But that's his reasoning here. That's his line of thinking as to why it's okay to use the society. Yes,
but don't we have examples where Paul and Silas or Paul and Barnabas were supported by a church, to go and preach the gospel? I mean,
right.
like in Antioch, weren't they supported by other churches? I mean, as a group?
We do have examples, maybe not of Barnabas, but of Paul. We have Paul and Barnabas being sent out by a congregation in Antioch. And definitely we know they were supported in the sense that they were chosen by that church. They laid their hands on them and they sent them out on this work. That's all we're told as far as the support of that local congregation. We do know from Paul's writings, of course Barnabas didn't write any, so we don't really know a whole lot about him, but we do know from Paul's writings that he did receive support from different congregations. In fact, it seems to be a pattern with Paul that when he would be in a new area preaching, that he made it a point not to receive any support from the Christians at that place. He wanted them to be free from any type of a burden, but he would receive support from other places if he could. And if he couldn't, then he would engage in labor as a tent maker to support himself. So you are correct that Paul did receive support in doing that. And as we'll see from the opponents, this is a valid argument here, that you're saying that there's really no authority here for the work of the church in an aggregate sense, and therefore we're free to do. But the reply could be, well, wait a second, but we do have examples of evangelism in the New Testament, and this is what it looked like. And the argument, of course, would be that, okay, well, what that looked like, that model looked like, was not multiple churches supporting, but rather individual churches supporting an individual.
Right.
And, of course, Campbell here would probably, I mean, he acknowledged that. Notice he's arguing the silence about corporate work or movement. And of course, that's the very thing that his opponents was saying. Yeah, the scriptures is silent about any activation of the church universal. And that, therefore, they were saying, we're not to do that. He's flipping that around, saying, because there is no anything stated about the church universal working together, therefore we're free to do that. Again, it's going back to that the silence issue, that he felt that left him free to do anything. The other side was saying, well, no, there's nothing. There's no examples, no teaching of activating, the churches in kind of a universal sense. So, we should do that. We do have examples, and this is how it works. So you're absolutely right. That'd be a very good, response to Campbell here. Again, these are quotes from those who are supporting the society. So this is how they viewed it. This was the way they were looking at it. But that's a very glaring omission, I would say, on Campbell's part. And actually, especially since earlier, that was how he himself argued on this. Why did you change, from that view to this view? And again, that would go maybe more study of him. Let's look at another quote here from his son-in-law, W.K. Pendleton. He became the editor of the Millennial Harbinger when Alexander Campbell died, and was one of the chief proponents of the Missionary Society. Pendleton also argued that the society based on silence was a matter of expediency and liberty. You say, he writes, your missionary society is not scriptural. And you mean by this that there is no special express precept in the scriptures commanding it. We concede this without a moment's hesitation. There is none. But what do you make of it? Is everything which is not scriptural therefore wrong? Again, does he say that it is not positively and expressly commanded? Then we demand, by what canon of interpretation does he make mere silence prohibitory? And finally, as noted previously, let it not be said then that the disciples of Christ are to take the silence of the scriptures on a given subject as positive rule of prohibition against all freedom of action or obligation of duty. No rule can be more productive of evil than this. So again, you see there the very obvious emphasis on expediency and the silence of the scriptures there. Again, this is an expedient. Okay, this is historian Earl West, his comments on the views of Pendleton and Pendleton. The basic apology for the society, Pendleton based upon his conception of the church universal. And in this, he followed closely the reasoning of Alexander Campbell. No man is prepared to see the society as Pendleton saw it without beginning where Pendleton began. First, he filled his mind with the thought of the church in its universal, that is, aggregate, as Campbell called it, aspect, ignoring for the time being the local church. God gave the church, in its universal sense, the responsibility to convert the world. But God did not give the method by which the church, in its universal sense, was to convert the world. Therefore, whatever method the church, in its universal sense, uses is acceptable. The method is a matter of expediency. The church universal is left free to decide for itself. This is briefly the defense he made for it. So again, you see the idea of expediency there. God told the church universal, go and spread the gospel. But he didn't say how, so that leaves it to be an expedient. But again, as he's saying here, notice the emphasis. He's looking entirely in a universal sense here. If he goes to the local church, he's obviously in trouble, isn't he? Because there is teaching. There is examples of what the local church is to do. So that's, again, how that they were trying to argue for the society. Go ahead, Bob.
All right, you got me confused here.
Okay.
The universal church, how is the universal church going to spread the gospel? I mean, I know it's left for the local congregation, but they keep bringing up the universal church.
Yeah.
Well, that's all of the saved over the whole world.
Yeah.
But that's not feasible. In my mind, it's not feasible.
Well, again, well,
They
again,
had to organize.
that's, well, yeah, I mean, I guess really look at that, that is kind of the argument, that at that point in time, they're looking at, okay, this is a work of the church in its totality, So, how does the church in its totality carry out the work given to it? And they're going to say, well, there's nothing really told us. So, well, a missionary society would allow us to get all of these churches to work together. So they're saying that God left it open for them to choose a method and expediency to make that happen. And
Yeah, but if you believe in the scriptures, and it specifically tells the local congregation to be autonomous, is that what the word is? I don't know. But
Yeah.
they're not to be controlled by any other congregation, they're not to be gathered together. I mean, it's very plain. But they keep bringing up the universal church,
Yeah.
which just,
Yeah.
to me, it just confuses
that's
everything.
that's really the impetus behind this change that's taking place. Is, again, as we talked about earlier, these individual churches that were being affected by the Restoration Movement or came into existence as a result of it, they have grown, multiplied. They're becoming large congregations. This movement has become a very, we'd say, influential movement in America. So those who are kind of cast into leadership positions are looking and saying, here's all these churches, here are all these, these Christians now, and we have, resources, we have power, we have influence. What are we going to do with it?
Yeah,
And
but
we want to keep this spreading. So they begin thinking of, well, how do we keep spreading this message? That's when their thinking shifted. Especially with Campbell, you see it, because before it was all about the individual Christian, it was all about the local church, and them moving away from the denominations, from getting away from the the organizations and all that, and just being a congregation. But now he's thinking in terms of, here's a movement, and here's a movement that people are looking at me for guidance, and he's saying, okay, well, we want to spread the message of Christ to the world. So how do we do that? So he shifts his thinking now to, well, let's activate all these churches and their power here.
But he's looking at the denominations around him and all they're doing, because that's what they're doing. So
That's what he was looking at before. Now suddenly
yeah.
he is, like I said, he's a complete switch in how he's viewing this. Suddenly he's not concerned about what the denominations are doing or what the groups that we came out of was doing. Now he's just simply saying, here's this movement. And, our message is one the world needs to hear. This is the message of Christ. All that thinking is kind of forgotten, it seems, at this point. And the whole emphasis is upon getting the word out. And, beyond that, we can't go into his thinking, to see, well, what's going on in his mind for him to be able to switch,
Well, I see that
it's a big switch.
He was, how do I put it? He was trying to evangelize the whole world, and he
Yes.
didn't see any other way of doing it.
Mhm. Yeah.
Is what it comes down to.
That's really it. I mean, his view shifted here again to a worldview of how can we convert the world. And we've talked about it again before, but he had this view that the coming of Christ would be hastened in when the world was evangelized. There'd be this new millennial reign of Christ that would come in, once the world was converted. And so he felt like, there was importance of bringing that new age in, a better age for the world. And the way to do it, of course, was to preach the gospel to everyone, not just in America, not just in parts of America. So, once his mind focused upon that, then that was his big goal. It seemed his mind strictly went to what is the most efficient way of doing this. And in addition to that, you did have throughout, quote, the brotherhood, quote, all these different congregations, there had already been a shift of a lot of these beginning to, have different types of conventions where they would get everybody in the state to get together, or they would have Christians from different states come together and have conventions. And so there was much more among these restorations, this mindset of here we are, let's get together and talk about what we can do. So, it was not just him, but, in a lot of people's minds, there was kind of a shift of, let's get together and organize. And he seemed like he was, he became kind of the head of that. And again, try to keep in mind where they've come from. And, we're looking back at this, how many years at this point? I mean, this was in the mid-1800s. You know, here we are, 2020, you know, too. And us, we have heard our whole lifetime teaching on this. And we have heard, you know, the difference between the universal church and the local church. And you know, but they hadn't. You know, they had their past experience of coming out of some form of denomination. They had this great change that took place where suddenly they were independent of that. And then suddenly they were faced with the future of, well now what do we do? You know, what should we do as congregations? And unfortunately, they fell back to what they had had.
That's what's so surprising, that they turned around so quickly. It really wasn't that long a period of time before they were going an entirely different direction.
But again, I mean, that's what they had come out of,
That's what they
you
come
know.
out of.
So they just came through a great change of, we need to reject this. And they continued to reject a lot of it, but they couldn't see, I guess, the fact that they were falling back into some parts of it. You know, I guess they could look at what they'd come out of, you know, if they come out of the Anglican church or whatever, you know, they could say, well, we're not, you know, burning incense, we're not, you know, having an organization or a pope. You know, they look at things like that and see, we're not doing those things, but they failed to see that this particular, you know, change that they were bringing in was going back in that direction.
And it was such a shame of what occurred after this,
Mm-hmm.
you know, but the divisions and all the divisions and how, it's just sad.
It is. It is. I mean, division among, you know, Christians anytime is
Well,
terrible.
it's still occurring.
And it is. That's why I'm kind of trying to reiterate what these viewpoints were, because as we shift to the 40s and 50s, and we shift even up to today, it's really the same thing. And a lot of people don't see that, particularly those who are kind of doing the same thing as a missionary society, but it's in different form. They fail to see that it's the same principle, especially among churches of Christ. You're going to see in the 40s and 50s, ones who came out of that division going back into doing the same thing and not seeing that it's the same thing, though. You got to remember that, you know, there's generations that pass on, you know, and the newer generations don't remember what happened or not aware, you know, of it. And again, that's why, to me, a study of this nature is so important, that we do know, we do remember what happened, you know, in the past, so that we can apply it to the things that happen in our lifetime. Those are excellent questions, and the frustration you feel is one I think anybody who studied history, the restoration history, has felt on this, you know, because it's, I think, much plainer to us than it would have been to them. You know, we see it hopefully fairly clearly, and it's frustrating. Well, why are you doing this, you know? But for them, I think it was much harder for them to see what was happening. And again, you know, they were where they were at, you know, in that little bit of, you know, seeing events just around them. It was hard for them to see the bigger picture probably too, you know.
It seems like they're trying to take away authority that has been given to elders or the local church, so that they can have power over many, which you don't know what the other two churches specifically are teaching.
Yeah, it definitely is a move away from the power of the local congregation to decide for itself, to do the work it's supposed to do. It's taking that and putting it into this society, and again into kind of a universal type organization. I mean, that's really what's going on here. Yeah. Let me read quotes from the congregation. We've got some quotes. We've looked at some quotes from individuals. Here's an example of a church, the Conningsville Church in Pennsylvania, how they reacted when this happened. Okay, the Connellsville. Oh, I'm sorry. We've already. Okay, stop. Hold that thought. We're making a switch here. Okay, we're going from those who were proponents, okay, to now looking at those who were, or excuse me, we were looking at those who were proponents. Now we're looking at those who were opponents in opposition to it, okay? And a really interesting quote that is not in our other book is, here's an example of a congregation in Pennsylvania who's seen these things happening and their response as a congregation to this. Now again, these are some quotes from those who opposed the Missionary Society. This is the Connellsville Church in Pennsylvania. And they responded to the beginning of the society with 10 resolutions and additional comments. Under the comments, they argued that the Church of Jesus Christ is, in its constitution and design, essentially missionary. We conceive it to be an axiomatic truth. Not a missionary society, but emphatically and preeminently the missionary society. The only one authorized by Jesus Christ or sanctioned by the apostles. Her president is Jesus Christ. Her constitution, the Holy Scriptures. The end for which she was established. The conversion and sanctification of the world. For this purpose, she is fully commissioned by her great head and fully qualified to fulfill that commission. To affirm that she is not competent is to charge her all-wise founder with the inconsistency of assigning her a duty which she is unable to perform. If then she is authorized and competent, all other societies for this purpose are not only unscriptural, but they are unnecessary and uncalled for. Unscriptural because they appropriate to themselves the duty and honor which rightfully belong to the church. Unnecessary because the end for which they are instituted, the church is fully able to accomplish. Again, this is a quote from Homer Haley's history we alluded to earlier. Okay, now does that sound similar to what y'all have been bringing up against what was being said there? Yeah. I mean, we see there's a difference in view, that they're saying, okay, you're saying we need a missionary society. They're saying, okay, we have a missionary society, not a missionary society, the missionary society, and that is the church. And they're saying, you know, the missionary society has a president, it has a constitution, it has laws, all this, and they're going to the local church and they're showing, we have a president, we have a constitution, we have laws, all this, the same thing in the missionary society, but it's in the local church. And they're saying, if you say that the local church is not able to carry out this work, then you are impugning or you are calling into question the wisdom of who? Of God himself. Exactly. That's what they're saying. So you're saying it can't do it. Well, who designed it? Who made it that way? God is the one who made it that way. And I mean, that's a pretty, how should I put it? A pretty telling argument that they make here. I mean, it really, you know, is making the point of, you know, who are you to set up another society and do the work of the church? But again, notice the difference there on the emphasis of the individual church versus the church as an aggregate, the church as a universal. Campbell, Pendleton, the others, again, they were trying to bring the society in on terms of this is a work of the universal church. These are saying, no, wait a minute. We're talking about the local church. That's what we have in the New Testament. That was what did this work. You have no business talking about a universal activating of the church, you see. That's one of the big differences here. And that's, again, you know, in our day and time, that's why we got to really emphasize the difference between the local church and the universal church, okay? One other quote from the Connellsville congregation. I tell you, they really had some good thoughts here in their response. And this was early on against the Missionary Society. The letter also argued its premise that the Missionary Society is a separate organization from the church and not merely a method. We know it is thought by some that these societies are not separate and apart from the church, but part and parcel of her. But by a little reflection, it will be seen that although they may be entirely composed of members of the church, which is not often the case, yet they are separate and distinct from her, as much so as any Freemason or temperance society composed of church members. Her president is not the president of any of them. Her constitution is not the constitution of any of them. Her laws are not their laws. She has initiatory right. They have initiatory fees. But comparatively few of her members are members of any or all of them. Hence it follows that they are distinct organizations, separate and apart from the church. Now that's a very important argument right there. Later on we talk about institutions, okay? Do you see what they're saying here? It is a separate organization. Evidently, some were trying to say the society, the missionary society, was just a method. It was a part and parcel of the church. Okay? They're saying, how can this be part and parcel of the church? And they show there that even if that organization had been made up entirely of Christians, still it would have been separate from the church because of all the organization, the different rules, the different, all those things show it separate. But then they go on to say, but let's look at the truth of the matter. It is not made up of church members. This society is not entirely made up of church members. There's a lot of others who are in positions of authority there. Now, that was for the missionary society, which did have a lot of members who were involved in it. But, go forward in the future, when we're talking about institutions, you're going to talk about organizations that did not have Christians that were, making up that establishment or that institution. So the argument, I think, is a really good one to kind of, hang on a hook in your memory and hold on to for later on. The other opposition are ones that we have seen in our book, Talbert Fanning with the Gospel Advocate. And if you've done your lesson, the next lesson, 12, you're going to see that the Gospel Advocate is going to be one of the main magazines used to support institutions and colleges and so forth. When it was early on, when we started though, it was, the writer there was Talbert Fanning, and it was against the missionary society. It was against the instruments of music, you see. So, isn't that interesting to see some of these, these do what? Yeah, it goes back to organizations. But yeah, these writings, these papers, start with one objective, and then later generations, they take a completely different view. It's always been very interesting to me. But anyway, and he's got quotes here from Benjamin Franklin, which we have also read in our lessons as well. Okay, the other big issue, as we said, was whether to bring in instrumental music into the worship. And again, our material here has both those who were for and against here. And we're quickly running out of time, so I'm going to have to kind of pick and choose here which ones that I bring out. So which one he starts with. I guess these are just general quotations. So those who took both. The debate around the instruments of music, again, is similar in one sense that, again, those who were for it argued it as an expedient. They argued that the scriptures call for worship, but it allows room for the use of expedients, and they felt that the instrument was an expedient to sing. Okay, it was an expedient to the worship in singing. Okay, that was the main argument that most made. I want to note though that there was a few who did try to argue from a scriptural basis to say that the Bible taught that the instrument should be used, and I want to read one quote here in that vein. It says here, the first to discuss the issue early on was McGarvey and Hayden. McGarvey against the instrument being brought in, Hayden arguing for it. So here is an example of McGarvey's response to the argument that the instrument was used by the Jews as a basis for its use in the church. West summarizes his response. McGarvey, as well as many other pioneers, saw that the very fact that the church, when established, rejected the use of the Jewish worship of the Old Testament was proof enough that the instrument was not suited to the worship in the church. The worship of the Jews was particularly fitted for the economy under which they lived. Their worship consisted of offering sacrifices, ceremonial washings, burning incense, and the use of instruments of music, among other things. The church, on the other hand, is the realization of an entirely different economy, fully spiritual in scope. Here God chose a worship where the worshiper directly from his heart worshiped the Lord without the aid of incense, animal sacrifice, or mechanical instruments. McGarvey then closed by saying, "Now, Brother Hayden, if this argument is valid, I again repeat that every man who bows to the authority of God's word must oppose the use of instrumental music in the church." Now, again, most who argued for the instrument used the argument of expediency. That was by far the most used argument, and particularly as time went on. Early on, there was a few, though, who tried to argue that the scriptures taught the instrument should be used in the worship. And here McGarvey is responding to one of the main arguments, and that argument was that in the Old Testament, the instrument was used. Therefore, in the New Testament, the people of God can use it as well. And again, there's a catch. They say they can. The argument that McGarvey and others was making was that we are under, of course, a different dispensation. The Christian church is different than the Jewish church, and as such, there's different needs. There's a different way of worship, and of course, I read you the quote. Part of this response too, though, is that some will go on and show likewise that under the old law, that was how they were required to worship. The instrument was required as part of the worship. God set forth exactly how it was to be used, and it was to be used every time. Now, those who are trying to argue for its use in the New Testament, they're saying because of that, we can use it if you want to. And the argument is, well, wait a minute. If it was taught back there that they were to use it, if it's to be used now, then it's something that God would likewise say you have to use. And this is how you are to use it. But then they show clearly in the New Testament there is no such instruction. That the New Testament doesn't say to use it. It doesn't say how to use it or in what manner it's to be used in the worship. Therefore, it follows that it was not used. And that's brought out by some others too in opposition to that argument being made. But you can see in the power of that response why they dropped that argument pretty quick about the Old Testament and went to more of an approach of, well, again, it's an expediency. And I think we have looked at some quotes in our book about the argument for it being expedient and some of the arguments against it. Just real quick, we've got about 1 minute. I just want to show us there was some who took what you might call a middle-of-the-road approach. And that is to say that there were some of these who, on these issues, made one argument for the missionary society and then took the opposite view for the instrument. Okay? And this is kind of interesting to see, especially early on. They weren't able to see that they were really the same issue. Okay? And so you had some that were opposites on these. It's only fair to point out that some men such as McGarvey, Lard, Allen, and others, on the basis of silence, justified the society and condemned musical instruments. So again, you think about that, it's kind of strange to think about. West Noakes, McGarvey, Grubbs, Allen, Lard, and S.A. Kelly each believed in organized societies and defended them vigorously upon the ground of expediency. They were, on the other hand, bitter enemies of the instrument in worship. Men of their mind in Middle Kentucky were slow to agree that both the society and the instrument stood on the same principle. What happened as time went on, these men began to realize that it's really the same issue in both of these. And so this kind of middle of the ground approach that some were taking, it evaporated as time went on. And become polarized that, okay, these stand or fall together. And so the views, went with that. But it's interesting that for a while you had those who were, taking two different sides there on these issues. All right. Well, we are out of time. I hope that reading these has been helpful. I really wanted you to hear these men speak, in their own words, both for and against these issues. To me, history comes alive when you read the words of those who lived in, not those who today are writing about them. But I hope that this has really maybe helped crystallize in your mind, again, the viewpoints of the two different sides here. And if it has, that will help us when we move on and look in our next two lessons at more current permutations of these issues. Well, I will stop there. And I am actually your song leader tonight in the invitation, so you're going to be sick of seeing me before we're done, I'm afraid. Need a drink of water. Did that help clarify anything for you all, or did it muddy the water for you?
It helps to me. Sometimes they're a little bit, looks like maybe they're a little bit long-winded.
They are that.
But I've never sat through a study, on that, so just recognizing the men and the ones that played a role in that is, you can just do so much in class. And you have to, if you really want to get into that, we have to do a lot of studying on our own too, but, it's good. And then the next one on institutionalism, I remember I first become a Christian, I remember, them, couple of preachers or the men, we studied some of the issues related to that, because, they knew that I wouldn't know anything about that, or what happened, and it may come back up, so.
Yeah.
We're studying.
Good. Becky, usually may say something too. It looked like you were. All right, well, I do hope it has maybe helped, again, kind of clarify the two sides there. If you do have questions, feel free to ask me as we move forward. We do have, like I said, a couple more lessons. One will be on the institution question and the cooperation question. And then the last one is kind of going to, from here to the future, kind of taking all these things and applying it to our times and what lies ahead of us as well, kind of a natural conclusion of this type of study. All right. Well, I appreciate you all, your patience and listening to this. And I agree with Jeff that if this has sparked an interest in you, definitely do get some of these books and dig into this stuff and read it. It's very, to me anyway, very interesting to go back and study these and read about them. And if you have that interest as well, definitely encourage you to get some of these books and to check some of the stuff out. All right, well, let's get our songbooks out and turn to number 210. Number 210, Walking Alone at Eve. Lonely soul. Walking alone at eve and viewing the skies afar, letting the darkness come to welcome me, silver star. I have a great delight in the wonderful scenes above. God in His heart and mind is showing His truth and love. Oh, for a home with God, a place in His courts to rest, sure and a safe abode with Jesus and the blessed. Rest for her weary soul, once redeemed by the Savior's love, where I'll be pure and whole and live with my God alone. Sitting alone at eve and dreaming the hours away, watching the shadows falling now at the close of day. God in His mercy comes, with His word He is drawing near. the Savior's love, where humming pure and whole, and live with my God above, closing my eyes at eve and thinking of heaven's grace, longing to see my Lord, yes, meeting him face to face, trusting him as my all, wheresoever my footsteps roam, pleading with him to guide me unto the Spirit's home. Oh, for a home with God, a place in his courts to rest, sure and a safe abode with Jesus and the blessed, rest for her weary soul, once redeemed by the Savior's love, where humbly pure and whole, and live with my God above. If you would please mark number 305, number 305, let him in. And walking along at eve, it's a sign I'm getting old. Is, you know, when I sing these songs, I think of those who used to lead these songs years and years ago. And we had a couple here when I was just a young man, probably Jaden's age, I guess, probably. Gene and Hibernia Bobbitt. Of course, some of you all remember him. A lot of you all never met him. But Gene was probably in his early 80s, I think, during that time period. Had never led singing, and we were needing a song leader. And one singing night, he got up and for some reason got up and led. He never had. And he did a great job. And one of the members said, well, Gene, you just need to be leading singing every time. And so sure enough, he started leading singing. And he led most of the singing for a few years there when we didn't have other song leaders. And he only had maybe 10 songs that he knew. And so he sung those songs every time. And this was one of them, Walking Along East. So I heard, you know, him lead that, and we sung it, I don't know how many times, over and over and over and over again, you know. But there's one part, you know, the wonderful scenes above, you know, at the end. I still to this day, I struggle with singing that right, because he sung it a certain way, and I heard it so many times I could not, you know, I could not switch how I sing it. But, you know, it's you can look at it bad or good, but I look at it as good as you get older to sing these songs and hear the voices of Christians you knew back then. You know, like I said, I was in my teens, he was in his 80s. I didn't get to know him that long, but I still can see him and hear him because, you know, he got up and led singing, and that's a neat thing. Well, I'd like to go back for invitation to 1 Thessalonians for just a moment. Paul had gone to Thessalonica after having a terrible time in Philippi, where he had been in prison. And when he went to Thessalonica, where these Christians were converted, he had a terrible time there too. That was just a really rough time during Paul's life and during his preaching. And yet, out of that came a small group of Christians that, as we read here in this letter, were exceptional. They were just everything you would want new converts in Christ to be. And so Paul writes a letter to try to encourage them and help them to continue to be faithful, because he is not able to go and be with them at this time. Now in chapter 2, Paul talks about how that their coming to the Thessalonians had not been in vain. And in the following verses, he sets forth why his coming to them had not been in vain. And there's two parts of that. Part of it was how he and the others preached to them, and then it was also an aspect of how they had responded to the preaching. Okay? Now, he'll pick up down in verse 13 some of the reasons as to why or how they accepted the preaching that made it successful. But from the first verse down to verse 12, Paul talks about some of the reasons why it had been successful from their standpoint of their preaching. Okay? So keep that in mind. Now, of course, we don't have time to really delve into this, but notice as we read this, if you can see some of the reasons Paul brings out why the preaching had been successful from the standpoint of how they preached the gospel. Verse 1, he says, "For you yourselves know, brethren, that our coming to you was not in vain, but even after we had suffered before and were spitefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we were bold in our God to speak to you the gospel of God in much conflict. For our exhortation did not come from error or uncleanness, nor was it in deceit. But as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, even so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God who tests our hearts. For neither at any time did we use flattering words, as you know, nor a cloak for covetousness. God is witness. Nor did we seek glory from men, either from you or from others, when we might have made demands as apostles of Christ. But we were gentle among you, just as a nursing mother cherishes her own children. So, affectionately longing for you, we were well pleased to impart to you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you had become dear to us. For you remember, brethren, our labor and toil, for laboring night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you, we preach to you the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and God also, how devoutly and justly and blamelessly we behaved ourselves among you who believe. As you know, how we exhorted and comforted and charged every one of you, as a father does his own children, that you would walk worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory." Just quickly, kind of enumerate a few of these things that Paul did that made his preaching here successful as he preached the gospel to them. The first was that Paul was willing to preach the gospel in conflict. In other words, he was willing to preach even though there was opposition to his preaching. In Philippi, as you remember, they had healed a girl with a demon, and as a result, they had been taken into custody and imprisoned, fastened up in stocks and bonds, Paul and Silas. And he seems to be referring back to that spiteful treatment. He said, in spite of that happening, we were still bold to preach the gospel in much conflict when it came to Thessalonica. As I said before, they had a lot of issues and troubles in Thessalonica. So one of the reasons of success, Paul would not let opposition or persecution stop him from preaching the gospel anywhere. And so these people heard the gospel as a result of that. He goes on to show also that his motivation was pure. Paul didn't come to them with some ulterior motive, wanting to get some profit or prestige from his preaching. It was a pure motivation of seeking their salvation. In verse 3, he says, the exhortation did not come from error. It did not come from uncleanness. It was not in deceit. He had a pure motivation for preaching to them. In verse 4, it goes on, talks about that God had entrusted them with the gospel, and that's what he says we speak. And again, he goes back to the idea of being able to preach in the face of opposition. The reason Paul then was able to do that, he says in verse 4, because they were not men pleasers. He says, we didn't preach to please men, but we preached to please God. And of course, that's always an element of successful preaching, is the motivation has to be pure, and the person who's doing the preaching, that they have to not be men pleasers, but trying to please God. And as a result of that, Paul says, we didn't use flattering words, we weren't guilty of covetousness, and he calls God as witness. God is witness that we were not guilty of those things. And he said we didn't seek glory from men, from you, or from others. When he says, as apostles, we could have even made demands among you, but we didn't. We wanted to make it very, he goes on to show, make it clear that the Thessalonians was their greatest concern. The other reason that they were successful was because their preaching the gospel was motivated by love for these people. Verse 7, he compares their care for them as a nursing mother cherishes her own children. And that's quite an image. You can't think of any greater love than a mother for a new child, and how much she loves that child and cares for the child. He said, that's how much we loved you. You were like little children to us that we cherished and wanted to care for. And so he's saying, you know, we love you so much, and we so much long to impart the gospel to you that we actually imparted ourselves to you. I take that to mean that Paul says we didn't just come and preach, but we became part of you. We connected with you. We gave ourselves to you in preaching the gospel. And again, it shows what love Paul had for them, that he was completely involved in their well-being. He goes on and he talks about the labor and toil that they put into teaching, that both night and day they labored. And they didn't even, accept any support because of their love for these brethren. And so they was willing to work day and night in order to be able to preach the gospel to them. And then he goes and uses another example, just as he talked about a mother. He says, was also like a father in the way that we exhorted and comforted and charged every one of you as a father does his own child. So again, the idea of a parental love. They felt like parents, that these were their children, and they would do anything for them because they loved them so greatly. And so they made sure that they walked as they should, that they'd walk in a way worthy of God as they preached the gospel to them. And of course, they wanted them to walk worthy of God. That was the purpose for their preaching. So Paul paints a very beautiful picture of how he approached preaching to these folks. And even though there was opposition and hardship, he was successful. There was at least some of those who heard the gospel in Thessalonica who responded, obeyed the gospel, and became this group of Christians who were extremely faithful to the Lord. And Paul was so thankful for that. And again, he wants them to understand why this was successful, why their coming was not in vain. Part of it was how they approached it. As I said, in verse 13, as we continue later, Lord willing, Paul will show that it was also them too, that these who obeyed the gospel, there was something about them that made his time there successful as well. And he'll bring that out as he continues here in his letter to them. But we want to stop here tonight. And as we see this great example of the power of the gospel and the example of how it should be taught, certainly as we bring this night to a close, we want to extend the invitation and say that if there's anyone here tonight who needs to obey the gospel, that we would hope you to have the heart and mind that the Thessalonians had, and want to obey the gospel in its simplicity and become a Christian. And we, of course, always want to extend an invitation too, that if you're here and you're a Christian, but maybe you're fallen away or have some sin in your life that you need to deal with, of course, we're always open to pray with you, to know of what you're dealing with, that we might encourage you. If that's something you need to let us know about tonight, of course, this is a good time to do that. We're going to turn our songbooks to the song that we announced. Number 305 again, Let Him In. And if you're, again, needing to respond to the invitation, we would ask you to do so as we all, at this time, stand up and we sing together. Number 305. There's a stranger at the door, let him in. He has been thereof before. Let him in. Let him in ere he is gone. Let him in, the Holy One, Jesus Christ, the Father's Son. Let him in. Open now to him your heart. Let him in. If you wait, he will depart. Let him in. Let him in. He is your friend. He Lord, let the Savior in Him, let the Savior in. I don't have any new announcements, just to please remember those we know already that are dealing with sickness at this time. I heard earlier Vi talking about Tim's continued struggle with his eye, and that they will need to be doing some more surgery there. So certainly keep Tim in your prayers. And of course, we have a number of members here who are got physical things they're continuing to struggle with. Please continue to pray for them. The Newman family, as far as I know, are still out on their travels, and let's continue to pray for them that they'll be safe and be back with us once again. But other than that, let's just all purpose to be back here Sunday morning. And Jeff.
Yeah, I was going to make mention that we had talked about if there's an interest in the budget. I've had a chance to take a look